Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Poland, Ukraine, White Russia, Slovakia, Hungary, the Czech Republic. All of these, the promise was made that we would not exploit this withdrawal in order to push the North Atlantic Treaty Organization and its forces further east. Obviously, that didn't happen. And Putin watched all of this and kept telling us, you've broken your promises, and you're moving your forces, your military power in this alliance closer and closer to Russia. We regard this as threatening. We don't want North Atlantic Treaty Organization forces on our borders. We don't want American military power sitting on our borders. Don't do this. This went on for years, and I think everybody ignored it because the assumption was that Russia in 2010, Russia in 2015, and Russia today is still the weak, exhausted, economically backward state that it was in the mid-1990s after everything collapsed. Well, that's not true. And Russia has recovered almost miraculously of a state of complete collapse and poverty in the 1990s. And that's what we were seeing. And secondly, everyone theorized that Russian society was not cohesive, that Russian society would crack. And of course, that has not happened because the opposite is the case. Putin's popularity standing with the Russian people is about an 89% approval rating. If anything, the Russian electorate and many of Russia's representatives and political leaders are critical of Putin for having pursued this war so deliberately and so cautiously. But Putin has always wanted desperately to avoid a conflict with NATO and especially with the United States. It's the last thing he wanted. And he did everything he could up until the last moment to prevent that. We have utterly refused to listen to the man. We've ignored the plea for neutrality in Ukraine. And finally, he's decided he had to go in. But this is not something he wanted to do. And we waste a lot of time imputing all sorts of evil things to the man, about which I don't know much, because you said I studied him. I'm familiar with the man, but I have not studied him in detail. But quite frankly, that's irrelevant. We're dealing with a great power. He is the man who leads the great power. This is a nuclear-armed power. This is an enormous superpower in terms of resources, looking at minerals, looking at gas, oil, a whole range of things. We ignored all of this, and now we have a giant Russian military juggernaut sitting where we didn't want it. Because one of the advantages that Ukraine offered if we made it neutral was that it meant that Russian military power would be hundreds of miles further east and nowhere near Western Europe. What we're watching happen right now is this enormous juggernaut is now going to move further west because Russian security dictates it. Because the Russians can't get any agreement from us regarding Ukraine. We won't talk to him. The only thing we say to the man over and over and over again, if you want an agreement with us, you have to publicly commit suicide, apologize for everything, and withdraw your forces. Well, this is utter nonsense. And we continue to threaten him with removal, which we cannot possibly achieve, and is utterly ridiculous. So we're at a standstill. Meanwhile, Europe is falling apart in every sense of the word. Economically, Germany is being deindustrialized. There is misery and misfortune across Western Europe. You're seeing what's happening in France. What we see in France could easily spread into Great Britain, ultimately find its way to Germany and parts of Italy, would be completely unsurprising. All of this is not a direct consequence of the conflict, but it's one of the effects that this conflict has had. You would think people in the West, led by the United States, would say, look, enough's enough. Let's sit down, let's talk, and come up with some arrangement, however imperfect it is, in order to stop the disaster that's underway. And we haven't even talked about the millions of human beings, easily 12 to 14 million, that are being driven from their homes and left Ukraine, probably never to return.
Neurologists are stunned. They've confirmed that ear ringing is shrinking your brain.
Yeah, the toll of human life is just unheard of there, but I mean, at least in the modern times, with what this is turning into, it's getting worse and worse every day. But when you speak on all those things, I really am reminded of kind of, you talk about who's in control now in our government. You have the Biden regime, and he is actually surrounded himself with Obama officials and Clinton officials and everything else. And I'm reminded of kind of Uranium One with the Rosatom taking control of 25% of our uranium, and all of these deals that the mayor of Moscow's wife, I guess, gave Hunter Biden some money, $3 million or something like that. And you almost have to wonder, without getting into like conspiracy theory territory, you gotta almost wonder, is this all just being given away? I mean, are we just doing this as if the West is suicidal? You know what I mean? Like, what do you think on that?
Well, there's a widely repeated joke. It's not really a joke. It's tragic, but people often talk about the three branches of government in Washington, and they say BlackRock, the international capital investment firm, Raytheon Corporation, and the other defense industries, and then finally Pfizer, the pharmaceuticals. The point they're trying to make is that donors currently own your government, and they control what happens in Washington. The American people, per se, are not terribly represented anywhere. In other words, there's no one terribly concerned about what is of importance to the average American. They're willing to provide whatever relief they can at the minimal level, but in the meantime, people in Washington are stuffing their pockets full of cash. And you're not going to get any help out of Wall Street. And of course, everybody everywhere keeps telling everyone in the United States everything's just fine. Now, that's fine for some fat cat on Wall Street that's worth millions. He thinks everything's fine. But if you're trying to feed your family, whether you live in Utah, Southern California, Arizona, Pennsylvania, doesn't make any difference, things are not fine. All you have to do is look at the food banks. We're having trouble keeping the full food banks filled, and we see more and more and more Americans.
I think you've got to go back over 25 plus years to discover the roots of all of this. And while it was very obvious, certainly by the year 2000, that the continuous expansion of NATO towards the Russian border would be met with extreme concern, if not real hostility by the Russians. The Ukrainian issue is actually secondary, in my judgment, or even tertiary to the larger matter of people who seem to be determined to destroy Russia. And that's a minority of these globalist leaders that we have both in Western Europe and at the moment in Washington. Globalist is only a partial description. We also have these people that call themselves neocons or neoconservatives. There's nothing conservative about them, and really there's nothing new about them. They're internationalists with a global military hegemony agenda. And I think these people hijacked control of our foreign and defense policy really in the late 80s, early 90s. This business really got off the ground under Reagan. It was there with President Bush Sr., the first President Bush, but it really came to fruition under Clinton. And there are a couple of things that I don't think most Europeans understand, and that is, at first, most Americans are neither interested in nor pay attention to anything that happens beyond their borders. When I was at Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers Europe, I had a Spanish General Staff Officer who summed it up brilliantly. He said, Colonel Macgregor, there's no such thing as the United States as a country. The United States is really a planet. And there's much truth in that statement. So an awful lot of what happens in our foreign and defense policy is of very little interest to the average American. And he takes on faith whatever his government tells him, which is a very bad habit, obviously. One would think that we were smarter, but we're not. And so if people tell us, well, there's a dangerous country here, country X, that led by evil dictators or dictator, and it must be cleansed of dictatorship and converted to the utopia of liberal democracy, people sort of shrug their shoulders and say, all right, I guess that's necessary. And the lesson of the last 25, 30 years is if you not take 1,000 casualties in one day, which inevitably wakes up the American people to what's going on, you only take a few casualties every day or maybe a few hundred every month, you're probably going to be able to get away with whatever you want to do. So that's the key lesson. And part of that lesson is that if you can wage war by exploiting someone else's manpower, then that's even better, because that means that someone else is paying the price in blood, not Americans. Therefore, whatever you do with money, with equipment, with weapons, once again, evokes very little response from the American people. So part of this is a natural progression to conflict with Russia, because Russia demonstrated remarkably to the entire world its ability to rapidly recover from total oblivion. If we go back to the 1990s, Russia was in just a horrible, horrible condition. And the population was demoralized, its armed forces were in ruins, and people in the West were quite happy. And large numbers of people from New York City and London, financial types, went to Russia with the goal of essentially stealing whatever they could get out of Russia, stripping it of resources, exploiting it, using it, buying up Russians, Russian politicians, oligarchs, and so forth, in order to gain access to the resources in Russia and strip them. All of this was ended by Vladimir Putin, former KGB agent. What a lot of people don't understand is that certainly during the Soviet era, the people who understood the most about the West and the most about the world beyond Russia's borders were KGB officers, because they were the select few that could actually travel. And Mr. Putin was an excellent example of that. He did actually spend time in the West. He actually quite pro-German. He speaks excellent German. He likes Germany and he likes the West. And that has been, frankly, a problem for him ever since he came to power in Russia, because there is this long-term strain in Russian thinking that the West is dangerous, the West is disruptive, it's destabilizing. But he's managed to survive all of that. And all through the very beginning of this century, Mr. Putin went out of his way to talk with each American president and with many European leaders, expressing his concern about avoiding a collision with the West by ensuring that the states on Russia's borders were not members of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. All of his pleas, all of his questions went unanswered, and ultimately his worst nightmare came to fruition. The first glimmer of what was coming came in Georgia, and that was demonstrated very conclusively by Putin that would not be tolerated. Even then, I don't think he thought we would do what we've done in Ukraine. Ukraine, of course, is a strange animal, because the construct, this national construct with borders, bears no resemblance to historic Ukraine or to where Ukrainians live. And this is a consequence of border changes that have happened dozens of times over the last 100 years, and probably 100 times over the last 1,000. So there's great confusion about, well, what is really Ukrainian, what isn't. And ultimately, Putin was willing to live with this bizarre construct that placed millions of Russians in eastern Ukraine and Crimea under Western control, provided he could get some sort of assurance that Ukraine would not become a hostile state to Russia, that Ukraine would not become an extension of NATO and therefore a potential launching pad for operations against Russia, economic, military, political, social, and so forth. He watched the color revolutions run by the National Endowment for Democracy and the CIA in various parts of the world. It was very clear to him that that too would pose a threat, and eventually that's what he saw happen in Ukraine. But there was never any interest on Putin's part, and frankly no interest in Russia, in this reconstitution of the Soviet Empire. Far from it. If there is a lesson the Russians learned from the Soviet period, it is, look, we don't want to manage these countries. It's an economic losing proposition for us. The populations don't want to be ruled by us. And he's never had any interest in expanding Russia back into Eastern Europe. At the same time, he took the Russian military and made it much smaller. He made it much better. He tried to modernize it and had some success in that department. But just how small the Russian military was, especially the army, became eminently visible to everyone in February 2022, when those first forces that went in, and there were only about 90,000 that went into eastern Ukraine, they performed very, very well. They did not take heavy casualties. They were not destroyed and stopped.